My name is Elliot Chambers. For almost 3 decades, I was the pastor of a conservative church in the southern United States. My faith was unshakable, my certainty unquestionable. I grew up in a traditional Christian home where the Bible was regarded as the sole authority over all things. My father, a strict and disciplined man, was also a pastor, and from a young age I learned that God's word was not to be questioned, it was to be followed to the letter. I always believed in that with all my might. When I assumed leadership of the church at 33, I did so with a deep sense of duty, believing that my mission was to preserve the purity of the Scriptures and keep my congregation aligned with God's unchanging truth. Since then, I have preached hundreds of sermons, counseled believers, and disciplined those who, in my view, strayed from the divine will. I did not merely teach doctrine, I lived it. Without concessions, without hesitation, never allowing myself to question whether my interpretation was truly correct. There was one verse in particular that I staunchly defended. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. 1 Timothy 2:12. To me, this was a divine, immutable, absolute command. Therefore, in my church, women did not preach, did not hold leadership positions, did not make spiritual decisions. They could teach children, sing in the choir, serve behind the scenes, but they could never step up to the pulpit and proclaim the Word. God chose men for that role. I never doubted that. I never even considered that I could be wrong. My community respected me for it. I saw my church grow, strengthen, and saw my authority as pastor solidify. The members trusted me. My fellow pastors praised my doctrinal firmness. I was right. I had always been right, or at least, that was what I believed. On that fateful night, the church was full. It was a special service, and I was on fire, seized by a sense of purpose. That night's sermon was about female submission in the church. I spoke with passion. My voice echoed through the temple, firm, secure, convinced. I saw the believers nodding, some murmuring Amen in agreement. I felt strengthened. I was right. God was on my side. But then, something happened. In the middle of a sentence, I felt an overwhelming tightness in my chest. A searing pain shot through my left arm. The pulpit before me seemed to distort. For a brief moment, everything became distant, unreal. My legs buckled. My vision darkened. The microphone slipped from my hand. I tried to say something, but my mouth did not respond. And then I collapsed. Time became a blur. Distant voices, cries, the sobbing of my wife, hands holding me. But I was no longer there. My consciousness remained awake, but my body lay fallen, motionless, on the pulpit floor. And then, for the first time, I saw myself from outside. I hovered over the hall, observing everything from above. The view was crystal clear, much sharper than it had ever been in life. I saw every detail, every expression on the faces of the people. The despair in my wife's eyes, the trembling hands of the deacons trying to revive me, the shock etched on the faces of the faithful. I could hear them, but their voices sounded muffled, as if they were miles away. They tried to call my name, but I was no longer there. Something inside me knew I was dead. But if I was dead, how could I still think? How could I see? How could I feel? My first impulse was to panic. I fought against the reality of what was happening. I tried to scream, but my voice did not exist. I tried to reach my wife, but my hands were mere specters, incapable of touching her. I was there, and at the same time, I was not. And then, something even more terrifying happened. The ceiling of the church began to disappear, not as if it were being destroyed, but as if it were simply ceasing to exist. The light was sucked away. The environment around me dissolved, as if the world I knew had never been real. I was cast into the void. It was dark, cold, an absolute nothingness. No sense of time, no space, only pure consciousness, suspended in infinity. I waited to be received in heaven. After all, I was a faithful servant. I had dedicated my life to God. I was right. I had always been right. But there were no golden gates. There were no angelic choirs. There was no radiant light. There was only the void. And then a voice. It was not an ordinary voice. It wasn't something you heard with your ears. It was something that penetrated my soul, reverberating in every particle of my being. A deep voice, full of authority, yet at the same time laden with something that unsettled me. Sadness. Did you really preach what I taught you? The question came like a silent thunderclap. It was not merely heard, it was felt. Every word resonated within me as if being etched into the very essence of my being. My mind spun in shock. It was Jesus. I needed no proof. I did not need to see a face. I knew. I always knew. I tried to answer, but my voice no longer existed. My justifications, my theological arguments, all seemed small before that overwhelming presence. But then, somehow, I was able to speak, and my words came out automatically, as a reflex of everything I had always defended. I preached the word, Lord. I followed the scriptures. I taught the truth. There was silence. A silence that lasted a second or an eternity. I couldn't say. Then, he answered. But was it your truth or mine? It was like a direct blow to the soul. I felt the question expanding inside me, shattering every certainty I had held for so many years. I wanted to argue. I wanted to quote verses. I wanted to defend myself. But then, before my eyes, something began to happen. Visions. They appeared around me like fragments of a non-linear time. I saw Deborah, the judge and prophetess, leading Israel with courage. I saw Mary Magdalene, the first to witness the resurrection. I saw Priscilla, teaching Apollos. I saw modern women, full of faith, yet silenced by religious leaders. Leaders like me. And then I saw myself. I saw the moments when I dissuaded those women. I saw the words I uttered, the looks I gave, the doors I closed. I saw the weight of my influence, not only on them, but on the entire congregation. I saw the fear in their eyes when they questioned whether God had truly called them. I saw their pain. And then I understood. I had not preached the truth. I had preached a tradition. The truth hit me with a devastating impact. It was as if all the certainties I had carried for years were being ripped away, undone, destroyed before me. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to cling to the verses I had used for decades to justify my view. But there, in that absolute void, before that presence that knew every part of me, there was no room for arguments. I saw everything. Not just the moments when I prevented women from exercising their calling, but the consequences of it. I saw the stifled prayers, the buried dreams, the ministries that never flourished because I, in my unquestionable certainty, prevented them. I saw women silently weeping, questioning whether God had really called them or if they were mistaken. I saw young people with a passion for the word being discouraged, demotivated, reduced to shadows within their own churches. And then, something even more painful. I saw the men who took the pulpits in their place. Saw those who were there, not because they were called, but simply because they could be. I saw churches where the Spirit was absent, where the word was preached without life, without fire, without transformation. With each vision, my heart shattered. I wanted to scream that it was never my intention. I wanted to say that I had only obeyed the scriptures, that I had only done what I believed was right. But I already knew. I knew that it wasn't about intention. It was about consequence. I had not only interpreted the word rigidly. I had shut my ears to any possibility that I could be wrong. I had never questioned, never allowed myself to reconsider. And now, before Christ himself, I saw what my blindness had caused. I felt an overwhelming weight on my soul, a pain I had never experienced before. The pain of realizing that my entire life, my mission, my preaching, everything I had done, had been based on an incomplete truth. I did not preach what Jesus taught. I preached what I thought he wanted. I tried to ask if there was still time, if I could correct my mistake, if I could go back and fix what I had done. But before I could form any word, I felt something pulling me. The void around me began to fold, to contract. My body, or whatever I was at that moment, was dragged by an invisible force. I wanted to resist. I wanted to beg for more answers. I wanted to understand everything I had just seen. But there was no time. In an instant, I was falling, plunging into something that seemed denser, increasingly real. The void disappeared. The darkness was replaced by an intense light, but it was not the light of the heaven I expected. It was something subtler, more familiar. And then I heard voices. My breath returned before I even opened my eyes. The air filled my lungs violently, as if I had been torn from one world and thrown back into this one. I felt my chest burn as if an internal fire was trying to rekindle something that had gone out. Then the pain came. Terrible, throbbing pain, as if every cell in my body was struggling to function again. I heard a cry nearby. I opened my eyes and saw my wife. Her face was awash with tears, her hands gripping mine tightly. "Elliot! Oh my God, you're back!" I tried to speak, but my throat felt as if it had been torn by blades. My vision was still blurry, my mind muddled. But I knew that I had returned. The hospital was silent except for the rhythmic sound of machines around me. Wires and monitors connected to my body, recording every beat of my newly resurrected heart. The fluorescent light in the room was harsh, almost irrelevant compared to the light I had seen, or the absence of it. I blinked, trying to orient myself, trying to understand what was real and what was not. My mind was still mired in visions, in the words of Jesus, in the question that echoed within me like a hammer striking hot iron. But was it your truth or mine? It was an unbearable thought. My whole life, my entire ministry, everything I had built. And what if I had been wrong? My wife continued to hold my hand tightly, as if fearing I might disappear again. Her eyes were red, her face wet with tears. "You died, Elliot," she whispered, her voice faltering. "The doctors, they said you wouldn't come back." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to process it. I died. Yes, I knew, but now I was here. I wanted to tell her what happened, to recount everything, but the words simply wouldn't come out. I was still trying to understand myself. My heart, once full of certainties, now seemed like a cracked cup, unable to hold any conviction for long. I had spent my entire life teaching that God spoke through Scripture, that His word was immutable and absolute. But now I knew there was something more, something I didn't fully understand, something I feared. What did it mean to be wrong about something so great? What did it mean to have spent my entire life teaching something that did not come directly from the heart of Christ? The following days were a mix of physical recovery and internal chaos. Doctors came and went, surprised at my recovery, but all I could think about was that experience. I relived every second, every word, every vision. I began to question everything. The Elliot Chambers who existed before that day was no more. The Elliot Chambers who woke up in that hospital was a fragmented man, carrying a weight that no one there could see. And worst of all, I knew I needed to tell the truth. But how? How could I explain to my congregation that Christ Himself confronted me? How could I admit that I, the pastor who had always defended his view with tooth and nail, had understood everything wrong? The first person I tried to speak to was my wife. When she noticed that I was hesitant, that my silence was not just due to exhaustion, she cupped my face in her hands and whispered, "What did you see?" Her gaze was intense, laden with both fear and hope. Then I told her every detail. The separation of my body, the void, the voice of Christ, the visions, the brutal truth that was shown to me. I expected disbelief, shock, perhaps even fear. But when I finished, I saw something unexpected in her eyes. Tears of understanding. "Elliot," she murmured, swallowing hard. "I always knew." My heart stopped for a second. "Always knew what?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than intended. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. I always knew that God calls whom he wills. I always believed that women had a greater role than we allowed, but I never had the courage to say it. I never wanted to challenge you. My wife's words weighed on me more than any sermon I had ever preached. For years, she had remained silent, not because she agreed with me, but because she loved me and feared upsetting what we had built together. That hit me in a way I wasn't prepared to face. I had always believed that my spiritual leadership was unquestionable, that I was the guide of my home, the pillar of our faith. But there she was, my wife, the woman who had been by my side throughout my pastoral journey, saying that she carried a truth that I had refused to see. And if she had known all along, how many others in my church also knew but never had the courage to speak? How many women had buried their calling out of fear of contradicting a tradition that I had helped sustain? That tormented me in the following days. I was determined to share my experience with the church leaders, but a growing fear took hold of me. It was not the fear of losing my position or my reputation. I already knew those things were fleeting. My fear was different. What if no one believed me? What if everything I said was dismissed as a hallucination or post-traumatic delirium? I knew those men. I knew how they thought. They were like me before that night, blind in their own certainty. And the truth was that I too would have reacted with skepticism if one of my fellow pastors had returned from an experience like mine. The irony of the situation was undeniable. I was about to face the same barrier I had imposed on so many others. On the morning when I finally gathered the church elders to recount what had happened, my heart was racing, as if I were about to preach the most important sermon of my life, and perhaps it was. When they saw me enter the meeting room, I felt the tension in the air. Some seemed relieved to see me recovered, others were more somber, as if already anticipating that I had something important to say. After a brief moment of silence, I began to speak. I told them about my heart attack, about the sensation of being outside my body, about the void, the darkness, and then about the voice that asked me if I had really preached what Jesus taught. The atmosphere grew heavy. I saw some exchange glances, others bowing their heads, absorbing my words. But it was when I began to speak of the visions that resistance started to emerge. When I described the women I saw, Deborah, Mary Magdalene, Priscilla, and so many others whom God had used to proclaim his word, one of the elders, Brother Nathaniel, crossed his arms and shook his head. "Pastor Elliot," he said, his voice laced with caution, "we know you went through something profound, but visions can be deceiving. The human heart is flawed, and Satan even disguises himself as an angel of light." I had expected that reaction. I knew they would try to rationalize, minimize, even dismiss what I was saying. "Brother Nathaniel," I replied, keeping my voice firm, "if this were merely a trick of the enemy, then tell me why Christ himself would confront me about the truth I preached. Why would he show me what I spent my life denying?" The ensuing silence was deafening. Some of the elders looked visibly uncomfortable. I could see the conflict on their faces. But the truth was this. I was challenging decades of tradition, and tradition does not die easily. The silence stretched on longer than I had expected. The men before me were not strangers. They were brothers in faith, men who had walked with me for years, who had helped build that church, who upheld the very principles I preached. But in that moment, I could see in their eyes that they no longer recognized me. To them, I was no longer the secure, unshakable pastor who had always led with authority. I was a broken man, a man who had died and returned with a message that challenged everything they believed was immutable. The tension was palpable, but I knew I had to continue. "I do not expect you to accept this immediately," I said, my voice heavy with fatigue yet resolute. "But I need to speak the truth. I saw what I saw. I heard what I heard. And if you trust me as your pastor, as your brother, at least consider the possibility that it was we who were wrong, not God." Again, silence. Then, another of the elders, Brother Matthew, who had always been one of the most respected, cleared his throat and spoke slowly. "Pastor Elliot, I respect you. I have always respected you. But what you are saying, you are asking us to question the Word of God. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. I am not asking us to question the Word, I replied. I am asking us to question ourselves, our interpretation, our tradition. I spent my life thinking I preached absolute truth, but now I see that I was only preaching what I had always been told was truth, and that cost me dearly. It cost many women their callings. It cost many churches the living presence of the Spirit. And if Jesus showed me this, who are we to ignore it? Some of the elders averted their eyes. I knew I was touching on something they did not want to address. Brother Nathaniel pressed his lips together, clearly disturbed. But Pastor, if we accept this, where do we draw the line? If we question one thing, what stops us from questioning everything? That is how churches fall apart. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the pain of that response. What stops us from questioning everything, I said, opening my eyes and looking directly at him, is that we have Christ as our guide. If Christ himself came to me and showed me that I was wrong, how can I continue to insist on being in error? The weight of the silence in the room was almost suffocating. I knew I could not convince them there, at that moment. Their beliefs were deeply entrenched, just as mine had been for so long. But I was no longer there to debate or win an argument. I was there to speak the truth that Jesus had shown me. I do not expect everyone to agree with me now, I continued, my tone calm but resolute. But I can no longer continue as if nothing had happened. I was confronted by Christ himself, and he made me see what I had refused to see for so long. I know that some of you may never accept this, but I can no longer be a pastor who silences those whom God has called. I saw the faces before me harden. Some avoided my gaze. Others seemed about to speak, but hesitated. Finally, Brother Matthew leaned forward and folded his hands. "Elliot," he said, this time without formalities, without the weight of the title, "if you truly believe this, then you know you can no longer be the pastor of this church." His words fell like a sentence long expected. I simply nodded. I know. My voice did not tremble. I had already made my decision before even entering that room. I would lose my position. I would lose the respect of many who had walked with me for years. But for the first time in my life, I felt I was doing something truly right. The following Sunday, for the last time, I ascended the pulpit. The temple was full, as always, but the atmosphere was different. There was a murmur among the members, a mixture of curiosity and unease. Everyone knew that something was about to happen, but few knew exactly what. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. I looked at every face present, men and women who had been under my teaching for so many years. Then, with a firm voice, I began, "My brothers and sisters, I am here today to admit something I never thought I would say. I was wrong." The hall plunged into absolute silence. I continued, recounting my experience, my death, what I saw, what I heard. I told of the voice of Jesus, of the question he asked me, of the visions. I told of the truth that was revealed to me. Some people shook their heads in denial. Others seemed to absorb every word. But then, something unexpected happened. A woman stood up, then another, and another still. I saw tears in their eyes. I saw courage where there had once been fear. They began to speak, to recount how they had always felt that God was calling them to something more, but how they had been discouraged, silenced, taught to doubt their own faith. I saw hesitant men looking around, confused, uncertain. I knew that for many, this would change nothing. They would continue believing in what they had always believed. But for others, that was the beginning of something new. I did not know what would happen to me from that point on. I did not know if my ministerial journey ended there or if God had something new for me. But I knew that for the first time, I was truly preaching the truth that Jesus wanted me to preach. And when I left the pulpit that day, I did not feel fear. I felt peace.